Hello everybody, Eric Rosenfeld here, and welcome to the Week 1 live lesson for Graphic Principles 2. This is a recorded and edited version of the live lesson because often we find watching the live lessons that are recorded on Zoom, well, honestly, there's a lot of sort of extra time built into those Zoom lessons where, we're responding to questions and we're dealing with individual issues. Instead of just kind of diving into the heart of the matter. So this is sort of a streamlined form of all those live lessons. Okay, so starting off, starting right away is one of the most common issues, and I'm going to repeat this a couple times, but the most common sort of stumbling blocks that students have when they first start using our lessons and getting used to Photoshop is the eyeballs here, okay? And you'll be looking for something and it's covered up. You always have to take a moment, look at your layers. Your layers panel is everything in Photoshop, and we stress this in the videos. We're going to stress it a million more times until it's really clear. And essentially, the layer that is on top is going to cover everything underneath. And because we use folders, or technically they're called groups in Photoshop, because we use these groups, you can even have sort of layers on and off inside that group, right? So you can be turning that off and on and not getting what you want. So you always have to kind of take a moment, open up the folders or groups, and then turn on to go find the layer you want. One option is just to make sure you have everything turned off, and then go turn on the layers so you can kind of go and figure out what everything is, okay? But it's all about paying attention to your layers and organizing them, okay? Now, let's go ahead and just kind of first talk about the week, and then we'll get into the particulars. So this is week 1. What I get for duplicating documents. This is week 1, and the most important thing about this week is that you're getting to know Photoshop and then reinforcing your Illustrator skills. So your first project in Graphic Principles 2 is actually just using all the skills you learned in Graphic Principles 1. And it's this, germ illustration. It's about simplifying, kind of cartoony, simplifying down a sort of complex scientific thing into a little bit more child-friendly or business-friendly illustration. Okay, so while you're doing that, you're also going to, dive into Photoshop. You're going to start getting used to know all about layers. You're going to talk about RGB Vs CMYK, which is even more important in Photoshop it's an essential element in all parts of design. You're going to really get used to using smart objects. We use smart objects all the time, and they're really powerful, but you can get a little confused by them if you don't sort of practice understanding and paying attention to what happens when you use smart objects. And then we're going to talk about using Illustrator and Photoshop together. Okay, so always go to that week 1. There's that video called the week 1 plan of attack where it'll explain everything. But you're going to, want to get these lessons done early. And there's a little bit of a difference. And we'll go over this today, but there's a turn-in file. You're actually going to turn in your file. Again, there's a video in that turn-in file explaining exactly what you need to do, but we'll review it again during this lesson. There's always a sort of, except for week 4, there's not a research and exploration, but it's just some quick things we want you to watch to sort of understand where we're coming from with design. There's a little bit of a quiz that's based off of your lessons and that research and exploration. And then finally, again, you're going to be working on that illustration project. That's the creative side of what you're doing, okay? So we're going to kind of jump around a little bit, but let me just first reinforce that, Photoshop, if you're brand new to Photoshop, it's going to be very similar to Illustrator in the fact that you need practice. There's a lot of hand-eye coordination that you do, using your mouse and your keyboard. And by the way, I really recommend getting a mouse. You can use a trackpad, but again, you hear me say this all the time. If you go into any studio, you're not going to see people designing with a trackpad. You're going to see people using a mouse or a drawing tablet. And for just general Photoshop use, I use a mouse for everything, and then when I need to paint I'll use a drawing tablet. But it's going to take a little bit of hand-eye coordination. Those mouse and keyboard combos are kind of important. And kind of need to put in your repetitions for mastery, just like working out. So if something doesn't quite, make sense to you, repeat that step 2 or 3 or 4 times, and until you kind of get used to like sort of the eye-hand coordination and the understanding of what you're actually doing. That's going to be really important. Quick little note about using a Mac versus using a PC. You're welcome to use either as you go through the degree. There are going to be differences, and you will find that the majority of the degree leans towards using a Mac. Most of our screenshots are going to be, or our videos are going to be done using a Mac. When we reference hotkeys, it's almost always Mac-based because that's what we all have. That's what the majority of our students have due to the launch box. That's part of the degree. But if you're using a PC, great. I used a PC most of my freelance career in motion graphics. And even though I've been using a Mac since 1984, believe it or not, with a Mac Plus, when my father got me got the family a Mac Plus. And but it's important to be able to use both. So I'm going to try to always remember to say both the Mac and PC hotkey. I don't always do that. Sometimes I'm going quickly, so I apologize if I ever skip. But just know that on a PC, you have all the same options, right? The software is exactly the same between a Mac and a PC. The only difference is going to be your hotkeys. So on a Mac, you have Command, you have Option, and you have Control, right? You have Command, Option, and Control. And Control on a Mac is really only used for right-click because the trackpad and the default Apple mouse in the beginning did not have a right-click. By the way, there's a real interesting history as to why Apple chose not to put a right-click into their mice. It's worth researching, okay? So Control is really if you're on your laptop and you need to right-click something and you haven't set up a right-click with your trackpad. On the PC, Control is Command, okay? So on a PC or on a Mac, if I'm going to invert color in Photoshop, I would say Command-I. On a PC, it would be Control-I. And Alt is Option. Okay, so on a PC, Alt is Option. So, and I can't think of a hotkey off the top of my head that has Option in it, but a lot of them do. So just be aware. Anytime we mention this, if for some reason I miss it, just if you're using a PC, you'll really get to you'll hear Command, but you'll understand that it's Control. All right. Now let's talk about layers and smart objects. And the most important thing is always knowing what layer you're on. So here I am, I have my layers panel up. If for some reason it ever disappears, it's always under Windows Layer, and the shortcut is F7 if you ever need to pop it open. By default on a Mac keyboard, you actually have to hit Function F7 because by default on the Mac, they've kind of changed the way the function key work. You can always go into your preferences in your system preferences and change that if you want your function key back. But always knowing where your layers are. And before I really do anything, I'm going to change the way my layers are shown. Because normally when you're working, these sort of small layers, they work pretty well. But you notice like here I have this grape here, right? And it's really kind of hard to see. Like most of that grape is actually covered up by the icon which is on that layer, which means vector smart object. So I'm going to come up to this hamburger menu. Anytime you hear the term hamburger menu, it's essentially, let's see if I can zoom in. Gotta move over. There we go. It's anytime you have like 3 or 4 lines right here. Hopefully you can see that zoomed in. That's a hamburger menu. And if I click on the hamburger menu, it's going to pop up, options for that panel. And I'll just come down all the way down to panel options. So go to my layers panel, hamburger menu, and panel options. Or sometimes you just say go to your panel options. And you can see there's a couple things, 2 really useful elements, and we stress this in the videos as well. One is you can make your layers bigger, your thumbnails bigger. So if you're having a hard time seeing what's in that thumbnail, you can make it bigger. For the recordings, I always make them as big as possible so you can see what layer I'm on a lot easier. And then even more important, right here, layer bounds. If I click this, it's only going to show you the thumbnail of the pixels that you have on that layer, and it's not going to show you the entire document. And I find that really helpful. There's also a couple other options you can always adjust. But I'll hit OK, and now there we go. See that? That's much easier to see for my old man eyes. But you don't need to do that if you don't need to. But that's if your document looks a little different than mine. It's just because of our setting. Okay, so I'm going to come over here to Photoshop Smart Objects, and again, just notice that you always have to pay attention to what folder you're in, because everything stacks, right? Everything stacks on top of each other, and you notice you can have a layer is highlighted. It means it's selected. I can click off and have no layer selected, and that happens quite often. And then you go try to do something, and it doesn't work. Now, sometimes it'll, usually it'll warn you, but if you're not paying attention, so you just, if things aren't working, the first step is to always go check if you have a layer selected and what layer are you on. Okay. Now, the other major part about layers is we have documents within documents within documents. These are called smart objects. They were introduced some time ago. I can't remember what version. CS4, CS5 maybe. And basically it means you can have layers that are merged, and then anytime you want, you can unmerge them. So you can see, you can tell a smart object by the little icon right here. And there's two types of smart objects. There's a Photoshop smart object, and then there's a Illustrator smart object, or they call them vector smart objects. So you kind of have a raster version and a vector version. And to get into a smart object, you have to go directly to the thumbnail and double click on the thumbnail. Now, this is the first example in Photoshop. You're probably used to it already in Illustrator, but this is your first example where you have to be very precise with your clicks. If you're somebody who doesn't always pay attention to what you're doing on a computer, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble because you're just sort of used to, kind of by muscle memory, just clicking on some things and you're not paying attention to what you're doing. If you do that, like if you accidentally double click on the name, you're just going to rename it. If I double click in this space right here, it's going to pull up my layer styles panel, and rarely ever want to do that. Okay, so I'm going to double click right on the thumbnail, and now you can see it added a tab up top, just like a web browser, right? So we can go back and forth. There's our web browser, sort of tabs, and notice, if I zoom in, it's a PSB, all right? There is a difference between, hold on, over here, a PSD, a .PSD, that's a Photoshop document, and a PSB right here, that's called a Photoshop, well, technically it's a Photoshop Smart Object, but because it's PSB, we call it a Photoshop document because we think we're cute and we like nerdy things like that, okay? So, the Photoshop Smart Object really can do almost everything a regular Photoshop document can do, but it actually is designed to be for very large files. You can actually create much larger files as a smart object because of just the structure of the file. However, you have to be careful. It is really easy to accidentally save this file, and when I save it, and kind of break that link to my document, it'll be saved as a Photoshop large document format, which is this Photoshop document, and not everything likes a PSB. You can open up a PSB in Photoshop, no problem. But I can't promise you going to InDesign or going to other things, as versions change, that could cause issues. So you have to pay attention to what you're saving. Every month we get a lot of files turned in as PSBs because, again, it's easy to get turned around. So just always pay attention to that extension. Okay? Now, the other important thing to know is you always have to know how to save. When you're using a smart object, you have to save twice if I change something. So let's say I come in here and just adjust the color of the entire document. Using hue and saturation, we want to make it purplish, right? So we made it purple. Now if I want to keep this, I have to save it twice. First, I have to save my smart object. So I'll hit Command S or File Save. And then I need to, and now you can close it if you want, right, at that point. But now I also have to save your master document, okay? Because if I close this, everything goes away. Technically, that smart object it's internal to your file. So if you don't save your master file, you're hosed. And the only thing I can say is it's always easier the second time when you redo something. That usually does not make you happier when you have to spend extra time redoing something that you've done already. Okay, so I double click on the smart object, and now I'm inside. You can say I have all my layers. This is a layer mask. There's just lots of different things that you can do, and I can change it. I can modify it if I want to turn off this number. Hit save, and then you can see there it is. Now, even better is, and we're going to talk about transformations later, but if I hit Command T to free transform a smart object, I can scale this from 0 to 100% as much as I want, right? So if this is a really big file or a really big photo that you've turned into a smart object and you scaled it down, you can scale it back up without losing any resolution. Now, you can't scale it above 100%. I've actually kind of already done this for this example, but if I scale it above 100%, it is still not going to look good, right? It still looks bad and pixelated. But it's a great way of sort of not throwing out data or not throwing out pixels of an image that you might need until you really need to do it. So smart objects, default Photoshop smart objects, we just double click on the thumbnail. There you are. You save it, close it, hit the little X, or hit Command W or Control W on a PC, and to get to your main document, and then always save that main document. Now, also, because you're coming from a Graphic Principles 1, and you're using Illustrator, you're going to want to use Illustrator with Photoshop quite a bit. Photoshop has drawing tools. It has, vector-like tools, but nothing's going to beat Illustrator. So if I double-click on the thumbnail for Vector Smart Object, wait a minute, there we go. You can see, actually, we can embed Illustrator files, and this is an Illustrator file. If I hit Command Y, you can see my outline. It's just really nicely shaded. But I can come in here and change. Let's just change something here. Give this a little bit of an issue. Oops. All right, so I'm going to put some little red highlights on a few of my grapes. Oh, I don't know if that means they're going bad. Too many there. All right, so I've changed them a little bit. Now notice, up top it says Vector Smart Object right here. It doesn't, it's not a real file name. It's just a temporary file that's somewhere on your computer that's embedded into that Photoshop document. So anytime you're in a smart object, you want to hit Save, not Save As. If I hit Save As, I'm going to break that link to Photoshop. It's not the end of the world. You just pay attention to where you save it, and then you re-import that into Photoshop. But if I come in here and just hit Save, and then I'll close that and jump over to Photoshop. By the way, I'm hitting Command Tab on a Mac. That's a great way of switching through your applications. Option Tab on a PC. It's been a while. I'm pretty sure that's the same option. And you can see it updates. As soon as I enter Photoshop, it just kind of re-imports that Vector Smart Object, updates it, and if I want to change it again, double click on the thumbnail, and I've added for some reason a little gray there. I'll hit Save. I'll go back to Photoshop. There we go. Updates it. So it's a great way. Smart objects, Vector Smart Objects are a great way to essentially use Illustrator inside of Photoshop. If you haven't been using smart objects up to this point and you've been using Photoshop for a while, I think you've been missing out and you'll really like using smart objects. Okay. Now, the reason I'm introducing this to you right away is because in almost all of our examples, there's going to be smart objects, right? So like I have this, in this next example that we'll talk about, I have this, lizard, and it's small. That way it's easy to find in your layers. But if we want to start messing with it, with full resolution, I can double click, and there's the full image, right? So that's why we use smart objects quite a bit, so we can have a very organized lesson file that you can always, hopefully find things a lot easier. And then you can go into the smart object, and then when you're working, you can see we only have to deal with one layer rather than 100 layers when we're kind of trying to learn something. Okay, so we'll go over in your lessons even further, how to import smart objects, how to make smart objects, things like that. But for right now, just know smart objects are awesome, and know how to get into them. Know that you are going to command click into the thumbnail, or not command click, oh my gosh, double click on the thumbnail, and then you will, that just threw me getting that wrong. And then you always have to save as you go. All right, we'll move on. Let's talk about pixels versus vectors. Okay, you're used to Illustrator already, and with Illustrator, Illustrator is so nice. If I jump back over to Illustrator, I make a new document. So often I will start a project and I do something I should never do. I just make a new document. I don't even pay attention to the resolution. Like, probably the only thing that would bug me here is that I made it vertical. And when I first start working, I like to, let me go to my artboard tool. I like to start horizontal just because it fits my screen a little bit better. But notice I'm not even paying attention to the document size, because when I'm creating things in Illustrator, it's vector based. I can rescale it. I can do anything I want. I can go take this into a large, print format, and I'm not going to lose any resolution. Okay, it's a luxury in Illustrator. You do have to pay attention to make sure that you're designing things appropriate for your media type. Like if you're designing for, something really small, you wouldn't want to add too much detail. So, but in the most part, you can be a little bit loose when you're in Illustrator. But when we're in Photoshop, you always have to pay attention to your number of pixels, because everything in Photoshop, everything, even things that are supposedly vector, are going to be rasterized at 100%. So right now, you can see up top, I'm at 52.6%. If I zoom in a little bit till I get about 100, this is the best this file could possibly look, right? And we'll look into the actual pixels in a moment. But if I go any further, I'm going to start seeing the pixelization. I'm going to start seeing the little squares, and then you go a little bit too far, and Photoshop even now puts this little pixel grid in there. You can turn that off and on, but I tend to like it. So when I need to snap things to the pixel, it kind of helps you line everything up. There are vector type layers. So if I come in here, you can see my type. Actually, I can take my type layer. Let me go to my type layer here. I can take this type layer and I can scale it up as much as I want, right? That's a big type. I can scale it up, and notice it allows me to do that because it's a vector layer. But if I zoom in, it's still pixels, right? Everything is still pixels, especially if I zoom in on a corner. You can see there's the anti-aliasing, which is the smoothing of those boxes. And, and so if you make your document small, and then you make a bunch of stuff inside that document can never be made bigger without sacrificing quality, okay? There's even shape layers. Shape layers are sort of, before we had smart objects, shape layers is how we did everything vector inside of Photoshop. And you can see I can scale this up. It's going to look good, okay? But with these shape layers, I can zoom in, and they're still pixelated at 100%, okay? Now, in, I think, your second lesson, we dive deep into this, but let me just go ahead and give you a little update for it. If I go to image and go to image size, this is the most critical part, is your number of pixels. You're going to hear me say this a lot. Inches and resolution, that's really important when you are printing, when you're exporting. But when you're working, the number of pixels is the most important thing. If you don't have enough pixels, there's very little you can do to scale it up without sacrificing problems. Now, we are getting artificial intelligence and cloud computing that will start scaling things up for us, and it looks pretty good, but it's not perfect. So you always want to have a big file. So just know that in Photoshop, it is a raster program. It's resolution dependent, which means have a fixed resolution, the fixed number of pixels, and everything in Photoshop is made out of those pixels. Now we're going to talk about RGB versus CMYK. We mentioned this in Illustrator, and in Illustrator, if I go back to Illustrator, with any file, we can go to File, Document Color Mode, and there's CMYK and RGB. And in the videos, we actually talk quite a bit about what's called color space. Color space is the amount of color that is possible to calculate based on sort of the mathematical ways you're calculating color. So the most known ways of calculating color is RGB, red, green, and blue, and that's called the additive color space. And where you're adding, the more color you add, it gets additive, it turns into white. So if you put pure red, pure green, pure blue on top of each other, it's white pixels. And then CMYK, it's called its subtractive color space, or subtractive color, where basically the more color you add of each of those colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, it turns into black, right? So if you take all those colors and you stack them together, it gets darker and darker and darker. And the reason you have black as a color is because often CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow, can't add together to get dark enough. So that's why we have the extra color black. Traditionally, CMYK is our printing method, and RGB is our screen method. And that's not a bad way of thinking about it. Just know there's always exceptions. I've used inkjet printers, very high-end inkjet printers before, that have had preferred RGB files because of the way they printed. So you just never know, and you'll hear us say this a lot, always talk to your printer to figure out what they need. But in general, CMYK is always in for print, and RGB, I will say, is you would never use a CMYK file for something that's going online. It would always be RGB. Okay? Now, if I bring up Windows and I'll go to Channels, just let you know, let me pull this over here, where it should be. And I'm going to go ahead and take a moment and make my panels bigger. It is, channels are actually where you would actually see all the individual color channels. And this is actually what made Photoshop very special. It's what allowed us to do everything we needed to do in the early days of Photoshop. These days, you're not going to your channels quite as often. There's some high-end techniques or some old-school techniques that we might go to these channels and use them. But even if I come over here and change it from mode, from RGB to CMYK, rasterize. Oh, I'm doing this for the entire document, so it's going to take a second. But you can see it'll just be CMYK. I'll undo it in just much longer than I expected. Come on, computer, you can do it. There we go. And you can see cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And it's just using grayscale values to represent colors. Okay. So just know that you kind of have those two color spaces. If I go up to image and mode, there's actually a bunch of others. We'll talk about them in your lessons. But the most important ones to know about is RGB and CMYK. Now, this next one is very important, especially if you're brand new to Photoshop. Because if I come up to Window, Workspace, and I'm going to reset just the essentials. Okay, so this is what Photoshop currently looks like if you are using Photoshop. Or you're brand new to Photoshop, you just installed it, and you're this is a real waste of space, and I've found a lot of beginning students very quickly get confused because it's really easy to have all your layers buried. Then you have to scroll to find those layers, and I've seen students working kind of like this. And so the best thing to do is take a moment and arrange your workspace. And I think I used this exact same joke in the lessons. I'm just going to repeat the joke. You don't have to be like me and set up your workspace like me, but if you want to be cool, do it like I do it. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my layers panel and just snap it. You can see it creates a little blue line. I'm going to snap it over here on the left. And I want to be able to use my layers across the entire screen. Now, again, everybody's going to have a preference. This is just mine, but it's also how I've seen a lot of students work through these. Take channels. I always stick channels, paths, or layers, channels, and paths next to each other because that way well, that's how it's always been. They're friends. You want to keep them together, but I'll often switch, jump from layers to paths. I like to have them up there. And then everything else, I like to set up to be kind of small. So I'll take all these, sort of, I can even collapse this. If I can adjust these however I want. So you can have as many columns as you want. But I like to just sort of combine these. And this kind of flows depending on what I'm doing. The one thing I really like is I like the properties panel. Okay, properties panel is really useful. Sometimes I'll stick it down here. And that way, if I don't have a ton of layers, I'll stick it down there. Or I'll just make sure it's at the bottom of my stack. Right? And you can even group these, so when you click them, go back and forth. Right? Adjustments are great. But the properties panel is very similar to properties panel in Illustrator. It changes depending on what tool you're using and what layer you're on. So you can, alter things very, very quickly. So, but essentially I'll do something like this. I will usually always hide the Learn panel, which, looks like they removed it in 2021. There's usually a Learn panel where you can kind of go through everything. And, libraries are great. I'll often make sure I have the libraries there. But, I'll just adjust this column, and I can always snap it bigger if I can't kind of find what I'm looking for. History I don't use because I use Command D. I tend to put color, swatches, gradients together. Adjust this a little more. Come on. A little finicky. I'm going to go ahead and there we go. I'll put libraries by itself. And again, you can just click on these tabs to open and close them. And so now you can very quickly have it. But what's important that you have easy access to all your layers. Also paths. Paths are critical. We're going to be using those tons. And so I like to set it up like this. And then as soon as you have it the way you like it, go up to Window, Workspace, and Workspace. All right, I'm going to call this the GR2 workspace. And you can even, change your tools and your menus. I don't recommend changing those as a beginner. And now anytime it gets confused or lost or something happens and you have tons of things floating, you just go up to Window, Workspace, and reset the GR2 workspace. Okay? So even if you're kind of, don't think that's important to you, take a moment and set up your workspace. I think you'll find it much nicer to use. Now let's talk about dealing with layers and get into the basics of manipulating layers. I'm going to go, I have a bunch of smart objects here, so I'm going to come first to this blue classic ribbon, it says, and it's just it's a document that I had, ribbon blue. I'm going to double click on the smart object, and you can see there's a lot of layers here. Well, not a lot. Well, yes, a lot of layers. There's lots of little pieces of each thing, and you can see it's grouped fairly quickly. But notice it's really easy to sort of get lost. And let's say I want to select my type in this red ribbon. Well, in this case happens to be at the very top, but let's say if it wasn't, it might be kind of hard to find. One little trick that I use all the time is I will hold down Command and then click on a pixel. And in Photoshop, if I Command click in my document, let me zoom a bit, and I Command click, you can notice it's going to snap to that layer that I Command clicked it on. I don't Command click in the Layers panel, I Command click on the pixel, and you can see it'll jump. That's really handy. However, this I'm trying to be dramatic. This does not work if you have the dreaded auto select on. Okay? Now, if you've been using Photoshop for a long time and you love auto select, well, good for you. All right, we can all have our opinions. But I really dislike having auto select on in any way, because what happens with auto select is it will automatically jump to whatever layer you have selected, right? So you can see I'm clicking around and it's jumping around to whatever layer I have. The problem is if you happen to have a semi-transparent layer on the very top, it will always select that semi-transparent layer and can get really annoying. I like to sort of like let's say I have this blue selected in the back, I might want to click here and move it around, right? And it's not letting me because it's always going to switch to whatever layer I'm clicking on. So if I unclick this, you can see back to my blue layer. Now I can move it around. No matter what I click on, it's only letting me move that layer. Okay, so I highly recommend, with my old experience, unclicking auto select. And every time I update Photoshop, it tends to turn it back on. So if you ever start getting mad at Photoshop, see if auto select is on. Okay, so with auto select off, I can, very easily, let's say I turn on this brown layer and I want to select that type, I can command click on that type layer, and notice it opens up my folder and zooms to that layer. You have to be precise. If I click the wrong layer, you can see it's selecting the wrong thing. But I find that really helpful. And in fact, if I want to select all the layers that are part, let's not do brown, that's kind of hard to see. All right, if I want to select all the layers of this red ribbon, I can command click on all the parts, and I'm going to hold on command, and then I'm going to hold down shift, which is the traditional add to your selection, right? So I can command click, grab all these parts, and then I'll grab the type. And theoretically, well, I missed the shadow, so let me... Hold on one second. I goofed. Let me do that again. I just wasn't holding down shift. So command plus shift, which is control plus shift on a PC. I'm just going to go grab everything. There we go. Well, I got everything. Well, I missed a few, but you can see what I'm doing here is allowing me to very quickly grab multiple layers and select them. So you command click, just click one layer, and then you command shift click to select more than one layer. I do this quite a bit when I'm being a little messy in Photoshop. I'm not paying attention to my layers, or God forbid, if I'm not naming my layers, then I might use that a lot to make something really quick and fast in Photoshop. For the next example, I'm going to go to right here to this lots of layers smart object. And this is a really interesting file because it is really complex. Now, I've downsized it quite a bit because it's, really huge. But it's an example of the type of illustration you can do when you have a lot of assets. Some of these things were made by hand, but most of them were stock images. And you can kind of combine these stock images into way more interesting things where the sum is, greater than the individual parts. But I'm showing you this one just to reinforce that as your work gets more complex, organization is going to be critical. Naming your files, using folders, just making a folder and double-clicking on it to name it, amplifier, and then putting things in the folder. It's a little thing, but it can be the difference between a project taking 2 hours and a project taking 4 hours, because you're always hunting for things. And this is, again, where you can command click to jump to, around, or at least to where that speaker might be. You can see, though, is a really good illustration, a really good composite. It takes effort and time, and you don't want all that complexity to be working against you. So organization is really important. Naming your layers and organizing them into folders is sort of the least you can do. Now let's talk about moving and distorting layers. This is something you do all the time in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to, I didn't name it, so I'm going to call this my robot. Vote robot. And I'll go into that smart object. And you can see I have, my vote icon here that's in perspective. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because there's the original photo. And I want to move and transform. Oops, and folder. Right, should name everything, right? So let's move them around, right? So in Illustrator, you have the select and direct select tools for moving things around. You actually have a free transform tool over here. But in Photoshop, you move things around. You actually have a move tool. Your select and direct select tools are down here. And you don't really use them for moving layers. This is only for when you're moving paths or vector shapes. So I'm going to go to my move tool here. V, by the way, it's the same shortcut between Illustrator and Photoshop. It's V. But But I can move, that folder all at one, or I can move them individually. I can move them individually if I select them. But if I select that folder and I need to kind of transform this into perspective, the hotkey is Command T. This is worth getting a tattoo of, so you don't forget. You can always go up to Edit and go to Pre-Transform. There it is. You can see how often I go to it. You can see Command T, or there's the whole transform options. But just memorize Command T. You hit Command T. Now I can scale. Brings up that bounding box. I can rotate. And I can even hold down Command or Control on a PC and click and drag on a corner. Okay, because it's type, because there's type in there, you can't kind of do like really critical transformation. So I'm gonna hit Escape and then hit Command T again. Because for this one, all I need to do is rotate it. I don't need to put it in perspective so much. I'm going to. And there's a little bit of a change in Photoshop now. You have to hold down Shift to break the aspect ratio. If I don't hold down Shift, it's always going to keep it nice and clean and in the correct aspect ratio. But if I hold down Shift, now I can kind of manipulate it. All right, so when in doubt, we'll just make it a little bit bigger over that sign. Okay, but just Command T, memorize it. The next example, well, let's just go ahead and dive right into the next example. Is just just to show you what you can do with layers and just some basic commands. So in this case, I want to make this perspective shadow. Okay, so I'm going to first do something you haven't done yet, which is I'm going to make a selection out of my rocket. Okay, I need to make a selection, so I'm going to hold down Command or Control on a PC and click on the rocket, and you can see it just basically selects around it. And I'll take a new layer. Again, these are all things you're going to be learning. I just want to show you how you can kind of make creative things with just your basic tool. So I'll name this one called my new shadow. And I'll hit Command D, select. You can always go up to select and deselect, but Command D is, again, we'll be hitting this in the future. But you can see now that I have this, I can hit Command T, and I can scale, rotate. But I can also hold down Command, just click and drag. You can see if I Command or Control on a PC, click and drag on that top point, it kind of moves these top 2 points together. If I let go and I Command drag on a corner, you can see I can transform that one corner. So I'm going to Command Control on a PC, drag, to kind of get this shadow falling a little bit on that wall. It's not going to look perfect yet, but you can see maybe I'll reduce its opacity, get it started. And now I need it to fall. That shadow is getting cast and it's going up that wall. So I'm going to take my selection tool here, just select those pixels. I just made a big selection of a box, but now when I hit Command T, I can do the same thing. I'm going to hold down Command. See, I'm going to manipulate those pixels to kind of fall up on that wall, and then I'll put a little blur on it. Not that much blur. And we could even control the blur so that it blurs more as it goes further away from the object, like how shadows behave. But this was just really doing Command T and then doing a few other things. And it's just an example of how all these little techniques, selections, pre-transform, things like that, they all will add together to give you the tool set that you need to do everything. So again, if you didn't know what I was doing there, it's okay. It's the whole idea was just to show you how you will start putting things together. We're going to wrap up sort of the extent of using Photoshop for week 1 with just the basics of selections, just the very basics. Now, even though these are basic, I still use them almost every day, right? It's not the only tools I'm using. If I try to do everything with the basic selection tools, everything would look horrible. But if I come into here, let me just go into my image, and I'm just going to do everything based off of this one image. So The first thing to notice is when we make a selection, any type of selection, so I'll just take my marquee tool, and remember, you can click and hold and find all your other tools underneath. But if I make a marquee tool, this area here, right, it's kind of annoying that it disappears when I'm zooming in, but this area here inside what we call the marching ants, and that's an old school technique or old school term. We've been calling them marching ants for probably 30, 40 years now, and not just in Photoshop. And it's just because they look like marching ants. But anything inside the marching ants is selected. Everything outside of the selection is not selected, obviously. That's pretty simple. If I hit delete, you can see exactly what we're talking about. But with all these tools, and I'm going to end with going through these basic tools, but what's most important is understanding the modifier keys. Shift, when you're making a selection, Shift will add to your selection, right? And then Option, or Alt on a PC, will subtract from your selection, right? So you can make, fairly complex shapes with just these tools. And, what I consider the basic selection tools are, and I just reinstalled, so it keeps popping up the help menu. I really don't like those. But you can say, rectangular marquee tool, that's just your rectangle tool. Elliptical, that's, a circle. You hold down Shift to keep it constrained. You need a perfect circle. And then you have your lasso tool, and the lasso tool is only really useful for some quick, like I wanted to do a quick, I want to cut this out onto its own layer and then focus on it. It's useful for that, okay, for a quick lasso tool. There's the polygonal lasso, or polygonal, depending on what part of the country you're from. And again, just makes very quick selections. And, the other hotkey you always have to remember is Command D. Okay, so Shift adds, Option deletes from your selection, and then Command D is just deselect. Okay, so whenever you're making a selection, and with the polygonal lasso, you can just double click and it'll end it. Okay. There's the magnetic lasso tool, not a fan of it. There's way better tools in there, so I basically ignore it. And then there's doesn't mean you can't get decent results, it's just not going to help you the most. There's the magic wand tool, which selects by color, right? And again, I can hold down Shift and add, and I can hold down Option to subtract. Just, especially for an image like this, maybe I want to grab all of these. On Shift. Still not going to be great. Let's see what happens. I'll hit Command U for hue and saturation. All right, actually, colorize. Right, it's not a perfect selection, but you can get it close and fix it. Okay, again, I'll hit Command D for deselect. Okay, and that's really your main marquee tool. So let me just go ahead and pop over to your practice file, because every now and again, usually, every now and again, people might have a little issue with this one, because they just have to remember Command T for free transform, right? And then you can hold down Command or Control to actually get the points in perspective, right? So that's usually an easy one. But then when it comes to selection basics, yeah, there we go. Practice, practice, practice. Really, the only one that people sometimes have an issue with is, I guess it's because we use the marquee tools to cut patterns out of the layers. This one here, you really have to use the polygonal lasso tool. All we want you to do for these is, again, experiment with the tools. Right? I hit double click to end it, and then and you come into your template, you press delete. For this one, it's a little bit tricky. You're just going to, again, make a box with your selection tool, and then hold down, I'm just going to hold down Option to subtract, but notice it never goes where you want. So I'm going to start in the corner and just get it close. I'm not caring that much for this example of what you're actually doing. I just want you to experiment with techniques so you understand what selections are making. There's so many other ways. The other thing is with this one here, you could either use the polygonal lasso, right? Or I guess you could make a rectangular box here and then go up to select and say transform selection, which allows us to rotate not the pixels but the selection. And I can hold down Command or Control on a PC, modify it. Right? But again, the big thing here with this first one is get used to Photoshop, and get used to just manipulating layers and finding the tool. Let's take a moment and talk about the turn-in template process. There is a step-by-step video that shows you exactly how to do it in the turn-in assignment. So if you download this file that you're looking at here and it doesn't make any sense, just go watch that video in the lesson turn-it file. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example so you can see me do it, and then you can go watch that video if you haven't, and you'll understand exactly what you need. So first, I'm going to take my type tool, letter T, or I'll just hit the type tool, and change my name. Right? Just in case the file, it's nice to be able to see who we're grading when we file. And then I'll turn off my instructions so you can see the template. And the template's going to tell you exactly what to do. Take a screenshot and make it a smart object of the Photoshop of try it number 1 with the layers panel. Okay, so I'm going to go to try it number 1. Here it is, try it number 1. I'm going to go into it. And I'm going to take a screenshot of my entire, now I haven't quite done it, but let's just pretend I did. Take a screenshot of my entire screen and paste it into my template. And then I'm going to make it a smart object. So I will, there's a lot of different ways to take a screenshot. If you're on a PC, you hit print screen, or there's some other tools you can use. On a Mac, my favorite way, and I go through each step in the video, but my favorite way is just to hit, now it's all your fingers. Command, Control, Shift, 4. That's my favorite. I hit Command, Control, Shift, 4. Okay, that's different on a PC. But now what I can do is it's going to give me these crosshairs. So I can just drag if I want I want everything like this. And it doesn't put it on the desktop like it normally does. It copied it to your clipboard or to memory. Now all I have to do is jump over to Photoshop. Hit paste. It's going to be big. It's going to give me some warning. That's okay. Hit OK. That's just because it's a different color space, or color mode, technically. Or, I'm sorry, color profile. And you can see, now I have my big layer here. Now, before I scale it down, I'm going to right-click, make it a smart object, and then I'm going to scale it down and put it into place. Now, why do we do this? Okay, besides us being a little crazy, or actually just mostly Eric, because this was my idea. It's because, we want to grade these. We want to see and make sure you can do everything. But we need to be able to very quickly see. And so what we do is, when I go to grade these, I will look at your screenshot. If I can tell what you're doing, yeah, this person really knows what they're doing. We're good to go. If I see a little bit of a problem, I can double click and I can look at your layers and I go, uh-oh, this student might be having some problem with layers. Let's go help them. Okay? Or if it's masks or, pen tooling or anything like that, it's just a really quick way for us to grade. And also you then don't have to upload 500 megabytes of files multiple times a week. And most of the time not even fitting on FSO. Okay, so just to kind of review that, you're going to go into whatever it's saying. So if it's, smart object of number 6, so I'll go to number 6. Sorry, there's a plane going by outside. Go into practice, number 6. Actually, I'll go ahead and do number 7 because it's kind of a funny image. And I'll do all the work, and then I'll take a screenshot of, Command, Control, Shift, 4. Take a screenshot of whatever I'm supposed to create. Take a screenshot of. Go back to the main document. Hit paste, Command V's paste, or go to edit paste. And I'll right click, convert it to a smart object, then scale it down. We want you to get in the habit of always converting things down to a smart object anyway. So I didn't even need number 7. Okay, but you'll do that for each one of these. It's going to take about 20 minutes, so it's a little extra time, but it's definitely well worth it so we can see the work that you're doing. Now, quick note, there's been an update it was with Catalina, might have been a little bit before, but if you hit Command Shift 5, this is a little new thing. It's the sort of screen capture widget that pops up, so that's Command Shift 5 on a Mac. This doesn't exist on a PC. I mean, there's programs where you can download that will do this. And what's kind of cool is you can capture the entire screen, capture a window, or capture just a select portion, right? So you can kind of set this up however you want. But even better, if I go here to Options, I can then change it from desktop, and it's going to save it to your desktop. I can change it to clipboard. And, there's lots of different options here, but usually you're either going to send it to your desktop or send it to your clipboard, which is your memory. And then I can just hit capture. It captures it. I'll go back to my main document, hit paste. There it is. Okay, so it's a little extra work, but just watch that step-by-step video if it doesn't make sense. Finally, let's talk about your project. There's multiple videos built into the project itself to kind of explain exactly what you're doing. So let's just do a quick overview. Your first project in week 1 is a vector illustration to sort of allow you to explore and flex your illustration chops. You just spent a month developing different types of graphics using Adobe Illustrator, and now we kind of have a little bit of an open-ended project, meaning we've given you a topic. We give you a list of germs or viruses, and by the way, we started this project well before COVID. This is not a reaction to COVID, but and you're going to sort of take a scientific idea, not an idea, a natural thing, a virus or germ, but it's so microscopic you can't see it, and you're going to illustrate it in a way that makes it a little bit more fun and less scientific, more for maybe for kids or for a work poster of some sort where you're trying to get somebody's attention and sort of seeing the same old kind of 3D render. You're seeing this same right now with COVID, you're seeing all the same image over and over and over again. So we want to kind of give it some personality. So you are going to, if I jump over to the actual assignment itself, just work your way down. It's a little bit lengthy, but just watch the video. There's Kira going through the steps, which is wonderful. Then there's a video I made with a bunch of examples, and you can see there's just lots of directions you can go. There's a very important "you must watch this or you will lose points" video. That's critical. But then you'll download the template and kind of work through these steps. You're going to choose your disease. You're going to learn a little bit about that disease. You're also going to explore vector styles. You're going to sketch, really get your ideas out, and then you're going to refine those sketches. We're not going to look at your thumbnails. We're not going to look at your rough sketches. I want you to turn in your refined sketches, and then you're going to recreate that in Illustrator. Now, a little warning. Those of you that kind of have a really nice sketching style or a drawing style sometimes have a harder time with this project because you keep trying to perfectly recreate your drawing in Illustrator. Your drawing is going to get you in the right ballpark, but then you're going to need to manipulate your vector work to kind of reflect the tools that we're using, which is Illustrator. So you're going to go through these steps, and but again, it's important that you're going to show your research, so show the images you're looking at. You're going to show your sketches, and then you're going to show 3 variations. Now, when I say 3 variations, I don't mean 3 completely different images. I want you to make 1 germ or 1 virus and then make 3 versions of them. Here's just a really good example. He created 1 virus. He made one that's sleeping like a dormant virus, and then one that's sort of, maybe feeling ill it's himself. Maybe he's got a little headache there or a fever. And then another version where he's just sitting there happy, just waiting to inflict some harm, I guess. So you're going to make, again, 3 variations of the same virus, but change the color, change the way you draw them. You'd be amazed when you redraw things. Every time you draw them, it gets better and it gets better. Just redraw them, experiment with them. Same with vector. Make 1, duplicate it, and change it. Change the eyes, change the way his expression. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you a few examples. And these are all examples. I had a folder on my computer. These are all examples from September of 2020. So I'm not cherry picking. I'm just going to give you. I'm going to give you feedback in the exact same way that I gave these students. So this was Vanessa's. Vanessa did a really nice job, and you can see, now her research was kind of all about the virus. I recommend researching also other types of vector styles to kind of give you a direction you can go with your vector shapes. She created 5, kind of nicer, tighter sketches of variations, so she can pick one. And then she ended up kind of doing a little bit, well, no, her variations are good. And you can see it's not overly complicated, but it needs to be well rendered. Everything needs to look like it is pen tooled well. Craftsmanship is going to be really important. And it's really, you can usually, you can tell instantly people who are pen tooling their shapes versus people who are like basing everything off of circles. Okay, so Vanessa did a good job. Let's see, Christopher's. Right, so he's exploring, sort of what that virus actually looked like, and then different ways of drawing eyes and different shapes here. Kind of fun. Kind of maybe Rick and Morty, but maybe there might be a different style he's going for. But again, his variations are kind of radically different, but they all have the same shape, and they all look good. Good pen tool work. Notice how like kind of smooth the paths are. Is a good project. Go a little bit further. You can see again the students researching, sort of these sort of like kind of making you itch type of thing. Nice sketches, and then a really nice job, kind of showing the sort of different personalities. Itching, but he's nervous or he's upset. Good work there. A little bit further. All right, again, researching kind of the vector styles. Again, really nice sketches. Sort of meat wad type of kind of look from, I can't even remember the name of that show now. And sometimes when you have, again, really nice sketches, it's a challenge to create the vector version. But I think she did a good job. Kind of the way the spines interact. I think it worked. Let's see, just a couple more. Again, research of different things that you might use, sketches, and then a lot of personality in those faces. Very kind of you don't need to have legs, you don't need to have a nose if you don't want to draw a nose. Just you're given a face, a personality to that virus or germ. Let's see, 2 more, or actually 1 more. So again, looking at all types of types. I would have loved to have seen a little more research into actual kind of like styles of flat vector illustration. That's okay. From sketches, nice sketches, and final results. Think of maybe a little bit more work on the way the eyes connect and the mouth, and then there's a lot you can do a lot more with like hands. You don't even have to draw fingers, but pen tooling some shapes is sometimes all you need. All right. There's some kids shouting outside my window, so you might hear some noise in the background. But make sure you're using the template. Make sure you watch the video that explains how to embed files in Illustrator. I know you've already done it since GR1, but if you don't remember, go watch that video. And I really, I love seeing every month the work that you create.